The scream cut through the storm before the carriage even stopped moving. Duke Alaric Thornwood gripped the door handle and threw it open while the wheels were still turning, ignoring the shout from his driver, Nathaniel, who called out that the road was too dangerous to leave the carriage in such weather. Rain came down in cold sheets, turning the dirt road into a river of mud, and lightning cracked somewhere behind the hills. But the sound he had heard was not thunder. It was a woman's voice, thin and broken, and it had come from the ditch beside the road. He jumped down before the carriage fully stopped, his boots sinking into the mud, and ran toward the sound with his coat flapping wildly behind him. Nathaniel shouted after him again, warning that bandits sometimes used cries like that to lure travelers off the road, but Alaric did not slow down. Something in that voice had not been a trick. It had been real pain, and real pain, he had learned long ago, did not lie. He found her a few steps off the road, half hidden by a fallen branch and a tangle of wet grass. She was curled on her side, barely moving, her dress torn at the shoulder and stained dark in places that made his stomach turn cold. Her hair was plastered to her face by the rain, and her hands were pressed weakly against her ribs as if she were trying to hold herself together. When his shadow fell over her, she flinched hard, twisting away from him with a strength that seemed to come from pure fear rather than any strength left in her body. "I'm not going to hurt you," Alaric said, kneeling down slowly, keeping his hands open and visible. "Do you understand me? I'm not going to hurt you." She did not answer. Her eyes, when they finally found his face, were glassy and unfocused, flicking between him and the darkness behind him as though she expected someone else to appear at any moment. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. He noticed then how young she looked, perhaps not yet 20, and how her whole body trembled not only from the cold. "Your Grace," Nathaniel called from the road, his voice tight with worry, "we should not linger here. If there is trouble nearby." "Bring the blanket from the carriage," Alaric said without turning around. "Now." Nathaniel hesitated only a moment before obeying, splashing back through the mud toward the carriage. Alaric turned his attention back to the woman, keeping his voice low and even, the same tone he might have used to calm a frightened horse. "My name is Alaric," he said. "I am not going to leave you here. Can you tell me your name?" Her mouth opened again, and this time a small, broken sound came out, not quite a word. She tried again, and this time he caught a single syllable, so faint he almost missed it beneath the rain. It sounded like the beginning of a name, but the rest of it dissolved into a sob that shook her thin shoulders. She pressed her hand tighter against her side, and when she shifted, Alaric saw the dark stain spreading wider across her dress. He did not wait for Nathaniel. He shrugged off his own coat and wrapped it around her as gently as he could, careful of her injured side, and gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than she should have been, far too light, and she cried out softly at the movement despite how careful he tried to be. Guilt twisted in his chest, but he knew that leaving her in the cold ditch a moment longer would be far worse than the pain of moving her. "Hold on," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Just hold on a little longer." By the time he reached the carriage, Nathaniel was standing with the blanket, his face pale with concern, and together they settled her carefully onto the seat. Alaric climbed in beside her, refusing to let go of her hand even as Nathaniel closed the door and the carriage lurched forward into motion. The ride back to Thornwood Manor felt longer than any journey he had taken in his life. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing shallow, her fingers occasionally tightening around his as though she were afraid he might disappear if she let go. Alaric kept talking to her in a low, steady voice, telling her that she was safe now, that no one would hurt her again while she was under his protection, though he had no idea yet what had happened to her or who was responsible. He only knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that whoever had done this would answer for it. When they finally reached the manor, lights were still burning in the front hall despite the late hour, as they always were when the Duke traveled. Servants rushed out at the sound of the carriage, and their startled murmurs filled the courtyard when they saw who the Duke was carrying in his arms. He barked orders before anyone could ask questions, calling for the household physician, for warm water, for clean linens, for his housekeeper. Mrs. Pemberton appeared almost instantly, her gray hair still pinned neatly despite the hour, her sharp eyes taking in the scene in a single glance. She did not waste time with questions either. She simply began giving instructions of her own, directing servants to prepare a room, to fetch dry clothing, to boil water. Within minutes, the woman was carried upstairs and laid gently on a bed in one of the manor's guest rooms. And Dr. Whitfield, who lived close enough to the estate to be summoned quickly, arrived not long after, his bag already in hand. Alaric stood outside the door while the physician worked, pacing the hallway with his hands clenched behind his back. He was aware, somewhere in the back of his mind, that his shirt was soaked through and clinging to him, that his boots had tracked mud across the polished floor, that half his household staff were now awake and whispering among themselves at the strange arrival. None of it mattered to him. All that mattered was the sound of movement behind the closed door, and whether it meant she was recovering or growing worse. When Dr. Whitfield finally stepped out, his expression was grim but not without hope. He explained, in the careful tone of a man used to delivering difficult news, that the young woman had several injuries, some old and some fresh, and that she had lost a concerning amount of blood. She was weak, dangerously so, but if she rested and was cared for properly, he believed she would live. He warned, however, that whatever had happened to her had clearly happened more than once, and that her body showed signs of harm that had been inflicted over time, not in a single incident. Alaric felt something harden inside his chest at those words, a cold and quiet anger that settled into his bones and did not leave. He thanked the physician, arranged for him to return the following morning, and then, once the household had quieted and the servants had returned to their beds, he pulled a chair to the side of her bed and sat down. She was sleeping now, her breathing more even than before, though her face was still pale and her brow occasionally creased, as though even in sleep she could not fully escape whatever haunted her. Alaric studied her features in the candlelight, the faint scar near her temple, the bruising along her jaw that was only now beginning to show its true colors, the way even her closed eyes seemed to carry exhaustion far beyond her years. He did not know her name. He did not know where she had come from, or who had left her broken and bleeding on the side of a lonely road in the middle of a storm. But he knew, with a conviction that startled him in its intensity, that he intended to find out, and that whoever was responsible would come to deeply regret what they had done. Hours passed before she finally stirred again. Her eyelids fluttered, and a small, confused sound escaped her lips as she took in the unfamiliar room, the soft bed, the fire crackling in the hearth. Panic flickered across her face for a moment, her hands gripping the blankets as though ready to flee, until her eyes landed on Alaric sitting quietly beside her. "You're safe," he said gently, keeping his voice low so as not to startle her further. "You're in my home. No one here means you any harm." She stared at him for a long moment, her breathing quick and shallow, before slowly, cautiously, some of the tension eased from her shoulders. Tears welled in her eyes, though she seemed to be fighting them back, blinking rapidly as though ashamed to let them fall in front of a stranger. Alaric leaned forward slightly, careful to keep a respectful distance, and asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since the moment he found her in the mud, the question he needed answered more than any other. "Who did this to you?" His voice was soft, without a trace of demand in it, only quiet steadiness, as though he were prepared to wait as long as necessary for an answer. But the woman only shook her head, her lips trembling, and turned her face away toward the window, where the storm outside had not yet begun to fade. Whatever words she might have had were locked somewhere behind fear too deep for a single night to loosen, and Alaric, watching her in silence, understood that this was only the beginning of a much longer story, one that he intended to see through to its end, no matter what it cost him. Morning came slowly to Thornwood Manor, the rain finally softening into a gray drizzle that clung to the windows like a curtain. Alaric had not slept. He had stayed in the chair beside her bed until Mrs. Pemberton, with the quiet authority of a woman who had managed this household for over 20 years, insisted that he change out of his ruined clothes and allow the maids to properly attend to their guest. He had agreed, reluctantly, only after making Mrs. Pemberton promise to send for him the moment the young woman woke again. By the time he returned, washed and dressed in dry clothes, the woman was awake, sitting up slightly against a stack of pillows, sipping weakly from a cup of warm broth that one of the younger maids, a girl named Clara, was holding steady for her. Her hand still trembled too much to hold it herself. When Alaric entered the room, she stiffened again, the same wariness flashing across her face as the night before, though it faded a little faster this time when she recognized him. "Good morning," he said gently, taking his seat beside the bed once more. "I hope you slept even a little." She gave the smallest of nods, her eyes dropping to the blanket in her lap. Clara excused herself quietly, leaving the two of them alone, though Mrs. Pemberton remained near the doorway, close enough to be proper, far enough to give them privacy. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready," Alaric said, watching the way her shoulders eased slightly at his words. "There's no hurry. You're safe here for as long as you need." For a long moment she said nothing, simply staring down at her hands, at the faint bruises along her wrists that had not fully faded. Then, in a voice so quiet he had to lean forward to catch it, she spoke for the first time since he had found her. "Eliza," she whispered, "my name is Eliza Hartwell." Something in Alaric's chest loosened at the sound of her voice, at finally having something real to hold onto after a night of uncertainty. He offered her a small, careful smile, the kind meant to reassure rather than to press. "Eliza," he repeated softly, as though testing the shape of it. "It's good to meet you properly, even under these circumstances. You are welcome here for as long as you wish to stay." She looked up at him then, studying his face with an expression that was difficult to read, part disbelief, part exhaustion, part something that might have been the faintest flicker of hope. "Why?" she asked. "Why would a duke concern himself with someone like me?" "Because no one deserves to be left broken on the side of a road," he answered simply. "Whoever you are, wherever you come from, that much is true for everyone." Eliza's gaze dropped again, and she did not answer, though her fingers curled tighter around the edge of the blanket. Alaric did not push further. He had learned patience in his years managing the estate and dealing with the endless disputes of tenants, merchants, and rival landowners, and he recognized when patience, not pressure, was the only path forward. Over the following days, a quiet rhythm settled over the manor. Eliza remained in the guest room, her strength slowly returning under the careful attention of Dr. Whitfield, Mrs. Pemberton, and the rest of the household staff. Alaric visited every morning and every evening, never staying too long, never asking more than she seemed willing to give. Sometimes they spoke of small, harmless things, the weather, the garden visible from her window, a book she noticed on the shelf across the room. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, and Alaric found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not mind the silence at all. Not everyone in the household shared his patience, however. Among the staff, whispers began almost immediately, spreading through the kitchens and the servants' quarters like a fire fed by curiosity and gossip. Some of the older servants, who had known Alaric since he was a boy, spoke with concern, worried about the scandal that might follow if word spread through the county that the Duke had brought an unknown, injured woman into his home and kept her there. Others, particularly among the younger staff, whispered with a kind of fascination, inventing stories to fill in the gaps of what they did not know, that she was a runaway bride, that she was the daughter of a rival family, that she had fled from something far worse than any of them dared imagine aloud. Mrs. Pemberton, ever practical, put an end to the worst of the gossip with a few sharp words in the kitchen one afternoon, reminding the staff that whatever had happened to the young woman upstairs was not theirs to speculate about, and that their duty was to care for her, not to invent tales about her. Still, the whispers did not vanish entirely. They simply grew quieter, tucked into corners and lowered voices, waiting for the day the truth might finally surface. Alaric was aware of the talk, of course. Little in his household escaped his notice for long, but he refused to let it change his course. He had made a decision the moment he lifted Eliza from that ditch, and he did not intend to abandon it simply because tongues were wagging in the kitchen or because his steward, Mr. Alcott, had begun making pointed comments about propriety and reputation whenever the subject arose. "Your Grace," Alcott said one evening, finding Alaric in his study going over the estate's ledgers, "I understand your compassion, truly I do, but you must consider how this appears. A young woman unknown to anyone living under your roof with no family to vouch for her circumstances. If word reaches the wrong ears—" "Let it reach whatever ears it reaches," Alaric said, not looking up from the ledger in front of him. "I did not bring her here to satisfy the opinions of the county, Alcott. I brought her here because she was dying in a ditch, and I was not willing to let that happen while I had the means to prevent it." Alcott fell silent for a moment, clearly choosing his next words carefully. "Of course, Your Grace. I only wish to protect your standing. There are men in this county who would use any excuse to diminish your reputation, especially given your influence in local matters." At that, Alaric finally looked up, something sharp flickering behind his eyes. "Then let them try," he said quietly. "I find I care remarkably little for the opinions of men who have never once concerned themselves with the suffering of others, only with appearances." Alcott did not press the matter further, though Alaric could tell from his expression that the conversation was far from over in his steward's mind. It did not matter. Alaric had made his decision, and nothing short of Eliza's own wishes would change it. As the days passed, Eliza's physical wounds began to heal, the bruising fading from deep purples and blues to lighter shades of yellow and green, the cuts along her arms closing and scarring over. But Alaric noticed that her deeper wounds, the ones that could not be seen, healed far more slowly, if at all. She startled easily at sudden sounds, flinching at the creak of a door or the raised voice of a servant calling out in the hallway. She rarely slept through an entire night without waking, and more than once Mrs. Pemberton mentioned quietly that she had heard Eliza crying softly in the early hours before dawn. It was during one of these evening visits, nearly a week after he had found her, that Eliza finally began to speak more openly, though even then her words came slowly, carefully chosen, as though each one cost her something to release. "You asked me once who did this to me," she said quietly, staring at the fire rather than at him. "I wasn't ready to answer then." Alaric sat very still, sensing the fragile weight of the moment, unwilling to disturb it with too quick a response. "You don't have to be ready now either," he said softly, "only when you feel it's right." Eliza was quiet for a long moment, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "I think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I might be ready to try." Something in Alaric's chest tightened, a mixture of relief and dread, knowing that whatever she was about to share would likely confirm the darkest suspicions he had been carrying since that first night on the road. He leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice as gentle and steady as he could manage. "Then I'm listening," he said, "for as long as you need." Eliza took a slow, shaking breath, her eyes still fixed on the flickering flames of the hearth, and for the first time since he had found her, she began, hesitantly, to speak of the life she had left behind, a life that, as Alaric would soon learn, was far darker and far more dangerous than he had imagined. Eliza spoke slowly at first, her words halting, as though she were testing each one before allowing it past her lips. She explained that she had grown up in a small village on the far side of the county, the daughter of a modest but respected farming family. Her father had died when she was 16, leaving behind debts that her mother struggled for years to manage alone. It was during that difficult time, when the family's fortunes were at their lowest, that a wealthy landowner named Josiah Wren had first taken notice of her. At first, she said, his attention had seemed almost like a kindness. He offered to settle her family's debts, to provide for her mother and younger siblings, and in exchange, he asked only for her hand in marriage. Eliza had been 18 at the time, frightened for her family's survival, and she had agreed, believing she was making a sacrifice that would save the people she loved. She had not understood, not truly, what kind of man she was agreeing to marry. "He was different before the engagement was settled," Eliza said quietly, her hands twisting in her lap. "Charming, patient, he brought gifts, he spoke softly. Everyone in the village believed I was fortunate to have caught his eye. She paused, her jaw tightening. It didn't take long after the agreement was made for that to change. Alaric said nothing, letting her continue at her own pace, though the muscles along his jaw had gone tight with restrained anger. Eliza described, in halting fragments, the months that followed, how Josiah's patience had vanished almost overnight once he believed her bound to him, how his temper, previously hidden beneath careful charm, had begun to surface in small, cruel ways at first, and then in ways that grew steadily worse. He controlled where she went, who she spoke to, what she wore. He grew furious over the smallest perceived slights, accusing her of disloyalty, of disrespect, of things she had never done. And when his anger reached its peak, he did not hesitate to make her suffer for it. "My mother didn't know the extent of it," Eliza said, her voice cracking slightly. "I didn't tell her. I couldn't. He made certain I understood what would happen to my family if I ever tried to leave, or if I ever spoke of what happened behind closed doors. He said no one would believe a farmer's daughter over a man of his standing, and he was right. Everyone in the village looked up to him. Everyone believed he was generous, respectable." Alaric felt something cold settle deep in his chest at her words, a familiar name surfacing in his memory: Josiah Wren. He knew the name, vaguely, from local gatherings and county matters, a landowner known for his wealth and his sharp business dealings, a man who had, on occasion, been present at the same events Alaric himself attended, though they had never spoken beyond the briefest of formal greetings. He tried to recall the man's face, the polished manner he presented in public, and found it deeply unsettling to reconcile that image with what Eliza was describing. "How long did this continue?" Alaric asked quietly, careful to keep his voice steady, though the question came out rougher than he intended. "Almost 2 years," Eliza whispered. "I kept telling myself it would get better, that if I simply did everything right, avoided upsetting him, it would stop. But it never did. It only grew worse." She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "A few weeks ago he told me the wedding date had been set, only a month away. I knew once we were properly married there would be no escape at all. No one would question a husband's authority over his wife, not even if—" She stopped herself, unable to finish the sentence, her hands trembling in her lap. "So you ran," Alaric said softly, filling in what she could not say aloud. Eliza nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away, as though ashamed to show even that much emotion. "I waited until he left for business in the city. I took what little money I had saved in secret and left in the middle of the night. I thought if I could reach my aunt in the next county, she might help me, might let me stay until I could find some way to support myself." Her voice broke slightly. "I didn't get very far before he found me." Alaric's hands curled into fists at his sides, though he kept them hidden beneath the table, unwilling to let his anger show too openly and frighten her further. "He caught up to you," he said, though it was less a question than a confirmation of what he already suspected. "He must have returned early and discovered I was gone," Eliza said. "I don't know how he found me so quickly. Perhaps someone in the village told him which road I had taken. I hadn't gone more than a few miles before his men caught up with my cart." Her breathing grew unsteady, her hands gripping the blanket tightly. "He was so angry, angrier than I had ever seen him. He said I had humiliated him, that I had shown the entire county he could not control his own betrothed." She stopped, her whole body trembling now, and Alaric had to fight the powerful urge to reach out and take her hand, unsure whether the gesture would comfort her or startle her further given the circumstances she was describing. "You don't have to say any more tonight," he said gently, watching the way her breathing had grown shallow and quick. "You've told me enough." "More than enough." But Eliza shook her head, seeming determined now to finish, as though having started she needed to reach the end before her courage failed her entirely. "He left me on that road," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "He told his men to leave me there, that if I wanted to run so badly I could see how far I got on my own. I don't remember much after that. I tried to walk, I don't know how long. And then I don't remember anything until I woke up here in this room, with you sitting beside the bed." Silence settled over the room, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the distant sound of rain still falling gently outside the window. Alaric sat very still, processing everything she had shared, feeling the full weight of it settle over him like a stone. He had suspected from the moment he found her that whatever had happened to her had been deliberate, inflicted by someone who believed themselves untouchable. But hearing it laid out so plainly, understanding the calculated cruelty behind it, the sense of a man so certain of his own power that he believed he could simply discard a person and walk away without consequence, it filled him with an anger unlike anything he had felt in years. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady, "for trusting me with this. I know it could not have been easy." Eliza looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but searching his face carefully, as though trying to gauge his reaction, perhaps bracing herself for judgment or disbelief. Instead, she found only quiet, controlled fury directed entirely at the man who had hurt her, and something in her posture eased slightly at the realization. "You believe me," she said softly, almost as if she had not expected it. "Of course I believe you," Alaric said firmly. "Why would you invent something like this?" "Because that's what he told me would happen," Eliza said, her voice small. "That no one would believe a word against him, that his name meant more than mine ever could." Alaric leaned forward slightly, his expression softening even as the anger beneath it remained. "Eliza, I want you to understand something clearly. Whatever standing that man believes he holds in this county, it does not place him beyond consequence, not while I have any influence to prevent it." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face as though trying to determine whether his words were simply comforting sentiment or something more. "What are you saying?" she asked carefully. "I'm saying that a man who treats another person the way he has treated you does not deserve to walk freely through this county, continuing his life as though nothing has happened," Alaric said, his voice low and controlled, though the intensity behind it was unmistakable. "I intend to see that he answers for what he's done. Not only for your sake, but because I suspect, given what you've described, that you are unlikely to be the only person who has suffered at his hands." Eliza's breath caught slightly at his words, fear flickering behind her eyes. "Please," she said quickly, "you don't understand what he's capable of. He has friends among the magistrates, connections throughout the county. If you try to move against him, he'll find a way to turn it against you, or worse, against my family." "I understand your fear," Alaric said gently, "and I will not act carelessly, I promise you that. But I will not simply allow this to be forgotten either. There is a difference between recklessness and resolve, Eliza, and I intend to move with the latter, not the former." She looked at him for a long moment, uncertainty still clouding her expression, but beneath it, Alaric thought he saw something else beginning to take root. A fragile, cautious hope, the kind that comes only after someone has endured so much they had nearly forgotten what hope felt like. "Rest now," Alaric said softly, rising from his chair. "We don't need to decide anything more tonight, but I want you to know that you are safe here and that whatever comes next, you will not face it alone." Eliza nodded slowly, sinking back against her pillows, exhaustion finally catching up with her after the effort of sharing so much. As Alaric turned to leave the room, she called out softly behind him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your Grace." He paused at the doorway, glancing back. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not looking away." Alaric held her gaze for a moment, something steady and resolute settling over his features. "I don't intend to," he said quietly, "not now and not until this is finished." He closed the door softly behind him and stood alone in the dim hallway for a long moment, the fire's warmth from the room behind him fading against the cool air of the corridor. His mind was already turning toward what needed to be done, toward Josiah Wren, toward the quiet inquiries he would need to make, toward the careful, deliberate work of building a case strong enough that no amount of wealth or influence could bury it. Whatever comfortable illusions the county had built around men like Wren, Alaric intended to see them shattered, piece by piece, until the truth could no longer be hidden behind polished manners and a respected name. And as he made his way down the corridor toward his study, already forming the first steps of his plan, one thought remained clear and unshaken in his mind. Eliza Hartwell would never again have reason to fear the man who had hurt her, not while there was breath left in his body to prevent it. The following morning, Alaric rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, his mind already occupied with the work ahead. He called for his steward, Mr. Alcott, and for Nathaniel, and the three of them gathered in the study while the household still slept, the fire barely more than embers in the hearth. "I need everything you can find on Josiah Wren," Alaric said without preamble, spreading a blank sheet of paper across his desk. His business dealings, his debts, his properties, his relationships with the local magistrates. Everything, no matter how small it might seem. Alcott's eyebrows rose slightly, though he did not ask the reason, having already guessed enough from the events of the past week. "That may take some time, Your Grace. Wren is careful about how he presents himself. If there's anything hidden in his affairs, it won't be found simply by asking around the market square." "Then we won't ask around the market square," Alaric said. "We'll ask the people who have actual dealings with him, tenants, suppliers, servants who have left his employment, people who have no reason to protect his reputation." Nathaniel, who had remained quiet until then, spoke up carefully. "Your Grace, if I may, I have a cousin who worked briefly on Wren's estate in the stables. He left the position rather suddenly a few months back. He might be willing to speak with someone he trusts." Alaric nodded immediately. "Arrange it quietly. I don't want word reaching Wren that anyone is asking questions about him, not yet." Over the following days, the investigation began in earnest, though Alaric was careful to keep it as discreet as possible, understanding that any hint of his intentions reaching Wren too early could allow the man time to cover his tracks, or, worse, retaliate against those who might come forward with information. He met privately with tenants from villages near Wren's estate, with former servants who had left under circumstances no one wanted to discuss openly, and slowly, a picture began to emerge that was far larger and far darker than even Eliza's account had suggested. Nathaniel's cousin, a quiet young man named Tobias, met with Alaric in a private room at a modest inn some distance from the manor, chosen deliberately for its lack of connection to either the Duke or Wren. Tobias fidgeted nervously with his cap as he spoke, clearly uneasy about discussing his former employer, but Alaric's calm, patient questioning gradually put him at enough ease to share what he knew. "He's not a kind man, Your Grace," Tobias said quietly. "Not to anyone beneath him, the stable hands, the maids, even his own tenants. He treats them as though they exist only to serve his convenience. I saw him strike a groom once over a horse that had thrown a shoe, nothing more than that. The man had done nothing wrong, and Wren struck him hard enough to leave a mark that lasted a week." Alaric kept his expression carefully neutral, though the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior grew with every detail. "Did anyone ever report this? To the magistrates, perhaps?" Tobias let out a short, humorless laugh. "Report Josiah Wren to the magistrates? Your Grace, half the magistrates in this county have dined at his table. He's loaned money to more than one of them quietly in ways that ensure their gratitude. No one reports him. Not if they want to keep their position, or their home, or worse." The words settled heavily over Alaric, confirming what he had already begun to suspect, that Wren's cruelty was not simply the private failing of one man, but something woven into the fabric of local power, protected by debts and favors and the quiet complicity of those who benefited from looking the other way. Over the following 2 weeks, similar stories emerged from other sources. A tenant farmer whose family had worked Wren's land for 3 generations spoke, with visible reluctance, of unfair rents that seemed to rise whenever Wren grew displeased with some perceived slight, of evictions carried out with little warning against families who had fallen behind due to circumstances entirely beyond their control. A former housemaid, now working in a neighboring county, wrote a careful, guarded letter in response to inquiries made on Alaric's behalf, describing an atmosphere of constant fear within Wren's household, of servants dismissed without pay for minor mistakes, of at least one incident involving a young maid that she refused to describe in detail, but which had clearly left a lasting impression of horror. Alaric compiled every account carefully, cross-referencing dates and details, building a record that grew more damning with each passing day. He met with Eliza regularly during this time as well, careful never to burden her with every grim detail he uncovered, but keeping her informed enough that she understood he was making genuine progress, that her courage in speaking to him had already begun to matter beyond her own situation. "There are others," Eliza said quietly one evening, after Alaric had gently shared some of what he had learned, careful to soften the harshest details. "I always suspected there might be, but I never had proof. He was careful never to let me see how he treated others, at least not directly. I think he wanted me to believe I was somehow different, that perhaps if I simply did everything correctly, I might be spared." "You were never the problem, Eliza," Alaric said firmly. "None of this was ever about anything you did or failed to do. Men like Wren don't require a reason for their cruelty. They simply require the belief that they can act without consequence." Eliza was quiet for a long moment, studying the fire. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Once you have enough evidence, what will you actually do with it?" Alaric considered the question carefully before answering, unwilling to make promises he could not keep. "I intend to bring it before the county's higher authorities, beyond the local magistrates who may be compromised. I have connections in the capital, judges and officials who owe their positions to merit rather than favor. If I can present a case strong enough, built on enough testimony, it will be far more difficult for Wren's influence to simply make the matter disappear." "And if it isn't enough?" Eliza asked, her voice tight with old, familiar fear. "If he finds a way to turn it against you, against the people who spoke to you?" "I won't allow that to happen," Alaric said, though even as he spoke the words, he understood the weight of the promise he was making. "I've built enough safeguards into how this investigation is conducted. No one has spoken to me without understanding the risks, and I've assured each of them that I will protect their identity and their livelihood as best I am able, regardless of the outcome." Eliza studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes, gratitude certainly, but also a kind of disbelief that anyone, particularly a man of Alaric's standing, would go to such lengths for people who held so little power of their own. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked quietly. "You could have simply cared for me, seen me safely settled somewhere far from here, and let the rest be forgotten. Instead, you've spent weeks pursuing a man far more powerful than most, gathering testimony from people who have every reason to be afraid to speak." "Why?" Alaric was quiet for a moment, considering how honestly to answer. "My father," he said finally, "was not a cruel man, but he was a passive one. He knew of injustices happening within this very county during his time as Duke, and more often than not, he chose not to involve himself, believing it was not his place to interfere in matters beyond his own estate. I watched, as a young man, the consequences of that silence. People suffered who might have been helped, simply because those with the power to act chose comfort over responsibility." He met Eliza's eyes steadily. "I promised myself, long before I ever found you on that road, that I would not make the same choice my father made. When I saw you that night, I understood immediately that this was exactly the kind of moment I had promised myself I would not walk away from." Eliza's eyes glistened, though she managed to hold back the tears this time, offering him instead a small, genuine smile, the first he had seen from her since the night he found her. "Then I'm grateful," she said softly, "more than I know how to properly express, that you kept that promise." Alaric returned her smile, something warm settling in his chest despite the grim nature of the work still ahead of him. "The gratitude isn't necessary," he said gently, "but I intend to see this through regardless. Wren has operated for far too long under the belief that his position places him beyond consequence. I intend to prove, quite thoroughly, that he is mistaken." As the investigation continued to deepen over the following days, word inevitably began to travel, as it always does in a county where everyone knows everyone else's business sooner or later. Alaric had hoped to maintain discretion for as long as possible, but he understood, even as he pursued each new lead, that it was only a matter of time before Wren himself caught wind that questions were being asked about him, and by whom. He was not wrong to worry. Less than 3 weeks after the night he had found Eliza on the road, a formal letter arrived at Thornwood Manor, sealed with Wren's own crest, requesting, in tones that were polite on the surface, but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of demand, the immediate return of his missing betrothed, along with a private audience with the Duke to discuss what the letter referred to as a matter of considerable delicacy and personal concern. Alaric read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each line, before setting it down carefully on his desk. He had known this confrontation was coming, had in fact been quietly preparing for it since the moment Eliza first spoke Wren's name aloud. But seeing the man's actual words on paper, dripping with false civility while barely concealing his true intent, made the coming confrontation feel suddenly, sharply real. He called for Alcott and gave brief, measured instructions to prepare for a visitor, then made his way upstairs to inform Eliza of what had arrived, understanding that she deserved to know before Wren's presence on the estate became unavoidable. Whatever came next, Alaric was determined that she would face it not as a frightened, powerless victim, but with the full protection and support of everything he had built in the weeks since that stormy night, and with the quiet, unshakable knowledge that she would never again have to face Josiah Wren alone. Josiah Wren arrived at Thornwood Manor 3 days later, precisely at the hour stated in his letter, his carriage rolling up the long gravel drive with an air of practiced confidence that suggested a man entirely unaccustomed to being denied anything he wanted. Alaric watched from the study window as Wren stepped down, straightening his coat with a small, satisfied motion, glancing up at the manor's grand facade as though already calculating its worth. He was not what Eliza's trembling voice had led Alaric to imagine, at least not outwardly. Wren was a tall man, well-dressed in fine, tailored clothing, with graying hair swept back neatly, and a face that might have been called handsome in a hard, sharp-edged way. He carried himself with the easy assurance of someone who had never once been forced to answer for his own conduct, and as he approached the manor's entrance, his expression settled into a mask of practiced concern, the sort a man wears when he wishes to appear the wronged party rather than the one responsible for harm. Alaric met him in the main hall himself, refusing to allow Wren the satisfaction of being received by a servant while he waited. Mrs. Pemberton stood nearby, her expression carefully neutral though her eyes carried a sharpness that missed nothing, and Alcott hovered a respectful distance away, prepared to note whatever might be said. "Your Grace," Wren said smoothly, offering a small, formal bow, "I appreciate you agreeing to see me. I confess I've been quite beside myself with worry these past weeks." "Mr. Wren," Alaric replied, his tone even, giving away nothing of the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Please, come through to the study. I imagine you'd prefer to discuss this matter somewhere more private." Wren's smile widened slightly, mistaking Alaric's composure for accommodation. "Very kind of you, Your Grace. I must say, word travels slowly in this county sometimes, but eventually it finds its way. Imagine my surprise when I learned my betrothed had been residing under your roof this entire time, and no one thought to inform me sooner." Alaric said nothing, simply gesturing toward the study door, and led the way inside without offering any comment. Once the door was closed, Wren dropped some of his performative warmth, his expression sharpening into something colder, more calculating. "I'll speak plainly, Your Grace," Wren said, settling uninvited into a chair across from Alaric's desk. "Eliza is my betrothed. Whatever tale she has spun to secure your sympathy, I assure you the truth is rather different. The girl has always had a tendency toward dramatics, and I fear whatever injuries she suffered were the result of her own foolish decision to travel alone at night through unfamiliar country, not any fault of mine." "That's an interesting explanation," Alaric said calmly, his eyes never leaving Wren's face. "Given that she was found half-conscious, badly injured on a road several miles from the nearest village, with no cart, no belongings, and no apparent means of having traveled there on her own." Something flickered briefly across Wren's expression, a flash of irritation quickly smoothed back into careful composure. "Regardless of the specifics, Your Grace, she remains my betrothed, promised to me under a legally binding agreement made with her family. I've come to collect her and return her home, where she belongs. I trust you understand the impropriety of a young, unmarried woman remaining indefinitely under the roof of an unmarried duke, regardless of how charitable your intentions may be." Alaric leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the man across from him with a calm that belied the fury building steadily beneath his composed exterior. "I understand a great many things, Mr. Wren. I understand, for instance, that over the past several weeks I have spoken personally with a number of individuals who have worked for you, lived on your land, or otherwise had dealings with your household. I understand that a rather consistent pattern has emerged from those conversations, one that paints a picture considerably less flattering than the one you're presenting to me now." Wren's jaw tightened, though he maintained his composure with visible effort. "I don't know what rumors you've been chasing, Your Grace, but I would caution you against placing too much faith in the complaints of disgruntled former servants and jealous tenants. Every man of standing accumulates enemies who enjoy spreading falsehoods." "Perhaps," Alaric said evenly, "though it becomes considerably more difficult to dismiss as mere rumor when the details align so precisely across multiple, unconnected accounts. A groom struck without cause. Tenants evicted without warning over rents that seemed to rise whenever it suited your temper. A housemaid who left your employment under circumstances she still refuses to fully describe." He paused deliberately. "And of course, a young woman I personally carried into this house, bleeding and barely conscious, after you left her on the side of a road in the middle of a storm." The room fell into a tense, heavy silence. Wren's carefully maintained mask slipped further, revealing something colder and more dangerous beneath the polished surface, though he still fought to keep his voice level. "You overstep considerably, Your Grace, involving yourself in matters that concern only myself and my betrothed," Wren said, his tone taking on a harder edge. "I would remind you that my family holds considerable influence in this county, connections that extend well beyond your own estate. I would advise you to consider carefully before pursuing this matter any further, for both our sakes." Alaric's expression did not change, though something in his eyes hardened into cold, unwavering resolve. "Is that a threat, Mr. Wren?" "A word of caution," Wren said smoothly, though the underlying menace remained unmistakable. "Reputations are fragile things, Your Grace, even those belonging to dukes. I would hate to see yours suffer unnecessarily over a misunderstanding that could easily be resolved by simply returning what rightfully belongs to me." At those words, "what rightfully belongs to me," Alaric felt the last of his restraint begin to slip. He rose slowly from his chair, drawing himself to his full height, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet, controlled intensity that filled the room far more effectively than any raised voice could have. "Eliza Hartwell is not property, Mr. Wren. She is not an object to be returned, collected, or claimed. She is a person, one who came to my home broken and terrified, having fled from a man who, by every account I have gathered, treated her and countless others beneath his authority, with a cruelty that I find, quite frankly, difficult to comprehend from anyone claiming to be a gentleman." Wren's face had gone rigid, a dangerous flush creeping up his neck. "You have no right." "I have every right," Alaric cut in, his voice sharp now though still measured. "As the Duke of this county, I have both the right and the responsibility to concern myself with the welfare of those who reside within it, particularly when there is credible evidence of sustained harm inflicted by someone who has, until now, believed himself protected from any consequence whatsoever." "This is absurd," Wren snapped, rising from his own chair, his composure finally cracking under the weight of Alaric's unwavering resolve. "You cannot simply take a man's betrothed based on unproven accusations gathered from servants and farmers with grudges to settle." "I don't intend to simply take anything based on accusation alone," Alaric said calmly. "I intend to present what I have gathered before the proper authorities beyond the reach of the local magistrates you've spent years cultivating with loans and favors. If the accusations prove unfounded, as you claim, then you have nothing to fear from a fair examination of the evidence. But if they prove true, Mr. Wren, I promise you that your standing in this county, and whatever protection you believe it affords you, will not save you." The two men stood facing each other across the desk, the tension in the room thick enough to feel physically. For a long moment, Wren said nothing, his expression cycling rapidly through anger, calculation, and something that might have been the first genuine flicker of fear he had shown since arriving. "You're making a grave mistake, Your Grace," Wren said finally, his voice low and cold. "Whatever you believe you're accomplishing here, I promise you it will cost you far more than you anticipate." "Perhaps," Alaric said evenly, "but I've made peace with that possibility. Have you made similar peace with the consequences that may soon come your way?" Wren did not answer immediately. Instead, he straightened his coat with sharp, angry movements, his earlier polished charm entirely abandoned now, replaced by open hostility. "I want to see her," he demanded. "If she's truly here under your protection as you claim, I want to hear from her own lips that she wishes to remain." Alaric considered the demand carefully. Part of him wanted nothing more than to refuse outright, to protect Eliza from ever having to face this man again. But another part of him understood that Eliza deserved the choice, deserved the chance to face her fear directly if she wished to, rather than having every decision made on her behalf, even by someone acting with good intentions. "I will ask her," Alaric said finally, "whether she is willing to see you. The choice will be hers, not mine and not yours. If she refuses, you will leave this house immediately, and you will not return uninvited." Wren's expression twisted with barely contained fury, but he seemed to recognize, perhaps for the first time, that he had lost whatever leverage he believed he held over the situation. "Fine," he bit out. "I'll wait for her answer." Alaric excused himself and made his way upstairs, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to ask. He found Eliza sitting near the window of her room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale. She had clearly heard, or at least sensed, that Wren had arrived, the entire household surely alive with the tension of his presence. "He's here," she said quietly before Alaric could speak, her voice steady despite the fear visible in her eyes. "He is," Alaric confirmed gently, crossing the room to sit beside her. "He's asked to see you, to hear directly from you whether you wish to remain here. You are under no obligation to agree, Eliza. If you would rather not face him, I will send him away immediately, and that will be the end of it." Eliza was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window, toward the courtyard below where Wren's carriage still waited. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly, but there was a new thread of steel running through it that Alaric had not heard from her before. "I want to see him," she said, "not because I owe him anything, but because I think I need to be the one who tells him it's over. Not you, not a letter, not silence, me." Alaric studied her carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation, any indication that she was pushing herself further than she was ready to go. But what he found instead was quiet determination, the first true glimpse of the strength that had carried her through months of suffering, and finally out onto that dark, dangerous road toward freedom. "Then I'll stand beside you while you tell him," Alaric said firmly. "You will not face him alone, not for a single moment." Eliza nodded, drawing in a slow, steadying breath, and rose from her chair. Together they made their way down the wide staircase toward the main hall, where Josiah Wren stood waiting, his expression sharpening into something almost triumphant as he caught sight of Eliza descending the stairs. A triumph that lasted only until he saw the way she carried herself, chin lifted, eyes steady, no longer the frightened, broken woman he had left in a ditch weeks before. "Eliza," Wren said, his voice shifting instantly back into its practiced warmth. "Thank goodness, I've been so worried." "Stop," Eliza said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through his words with a clarity that seemed to surprise even her. "You didn't worry about me, Josiah. You worried about what people might say if they learned the truth." Wren's expression faltered, the mask slipping further. "Eliza, whatever you believe happened, I assure you." "I don't need you to assure me of anything," Eliza said, taking a small step forward, though Alaric noticed she remained close enough to him that their shoulders nearly touched, drawing quiet strength from his presence beside her. I remember exactly what happened. I remember every single night of the past 2 years. And I am not going back to that life, not now, not ever. The color drained from Ren's face, replaced by a dangerous, simmering anger that he could no longer fully disguise. You would humiliate me publicly, over what, some misunderstanding blown entirely out of proportion. There is no misunderstanding, Eliza said, her voice growing steadier with each word. And I am no longer afraid of what happens if the truth becomes known. Whatever the Duke chooses to do with what he has learned, I intend to support it fully, and I intend to speak the truth myself, whenever and wherever it is needed. Ren's gaze snapped toward Alaric, fury and disbelief warring across his features. You've turned her against me. I did no such thing, Alaric said calmly. I simply gave her a place where she could finally speak without fear of what might happen to her for doing so. Whatever she has chosen to say today, Mr. Ren, those are her own words, born of her own courage. I would suggest you take them seriously. For a long, tense moment, Ren stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his entire body rigid with barely suppressed rage. Then, with visible effort, he forced his expression back into something colder, more controlled, though the fury beneath it remained unmistakable. This isn't finished, he said, his voice low and threatening as he turned toward the door. Either of you. I promise you both, this is far from finished. He stormed out of the manor without another word, his carriage pulling away down the gravel drive with far less composure than it had arrived, wheels spinning briefly against the stones before finding traction. Alaric and Eliza stood together in the entrance hall, watching until the carriage disappeared beyond the tree line, the silence afterward heavy with everything that had just occurred. You were remarkable, Alaric said quietly, turning to look at her, genuine admiration evident in his voice. Eliza let out a shaky breath, some of her composure finally cracking now that Ren was gone, though what remained beneath it was not fear, but something closer to fierce, hard-won relief. I've never spoken to him that way before, she said softly. I didn't know I still had it in me. You did, Alaric said firmly, and you will continue to for as long as this takes, but you will not do it alone, not today, not ever again. Eliza looked up at him, something warm and grateful passing between them, though beneath the relief of the moment, both of them understood clearly that Ren's parting words had not been an empty threat. Whatever quiet, careful investigation Alaric had conducted until now was about to become something far more public, far more dangerous, and Josiah Ren, humiliated and furious, was unlikely to simply retreat without a fight of his own. In the days following Ren's furious departure from Thornwood Manor, Alaric understood that whatever careful discretion he had maintained until now would no longer be possible. Ren would not sit quietly and wait to be exposed. Men like him, accustomed to controlling every situation through wealth, intimidation, or influence, tended to strike back the moment they felt cornered, and Alaric intended to be prepared for whatever form that retaliation might take. He called a private meeting at the manor, gathering not only Alcott and Nathaniel, but also Dr. Whitfield, who had treated more than one patient over the years bearing injuries no one dared explain honestly, and a young magistrate named Edmund Fairfax, one of the few local officials Alaric trusted implicitly, having known him since their years together at university, before Fairfax returned to serve his home county with genuine integrity rather than personal ambition. The evidence I've gathered so far is substantial, Alaric said, laying out the collected testimonies and written accounts across his desk. But I'm aware that testimony alone, particularly from tenants and former servants, may not be enough to overcome Ren's influence with the local magistrates. I need this brought before someone entirely outside his reach. Fairfax studied the documents carefully, his expression growing grimmer with each page he reviewed. This is more extensive than I realized, he admitted quietly. I'd heard whispers over the years, nothing concrete enough to act on, but this, he gestured at the stack of testimonies. This paints a clear and troubling pattern. Can it reach the regional court? Alaric asked. Beyond the local magistrates entirely. It can, Fairfax said, provided we can secure enough witnesses willing to testify formally, under oath, rather than simply providing private accounts. That will be considerably harder. People who spoke to you privately may hesitate to repeat those words publicly, especially against a man with Wren's resources and reputation. Alaric had anticipated this difficulty, and over the following days he devoted himself to addressing it directly. He began by ensuring that every individual who had already spoken to him understood, clearly and explicitly, that he intended to protect them from any retaliation Wren might attempt, whether financial, social, or otherwise. For tenants facing potential eviction or debt collection at Wren's hands, Alaric quietly extended offers of alternative housing on his own estate lands, at fair and manageable terms. For former servants worried about securing future employment without a reference from their previous households, he offered his own personal recommendation, backed by the full weight of his name and title. It was not simply generosity for its own sake, though Alaric's genuine concern for these people was real. It was also, he understood clearly, a necessary foundation, without security, without some assurance that speaking the truth would not cost them everything they had. Few would find the courage to stand publicly against a man as powerful and vindictive as Josiah Wren. Word of the Duke's efforts began to spread through the county with surprising speed, carried first through the same channels of gossip that had once whispered about Eliza's mysterious arrival at the manor, but now carrying a different tone entirely. Where once the talk had been curious speculation, it slowly shifted into something closer to cautious hope, particularly among the county's tenant farmers and laboring families, many of whom had long harbored quiet grievances against landowners like Wren, but had never believed anyone with real power would take those grievances seriously. One by one, more people began to come forward, some directly to Alaric, others through Fairfax's careful, discreet inquiries. A tenant family from the eastern edge of Wren's land described, in detail, an eviction carried out in the dead of winter after they had fallen behind on rent following a poor harvest, despite decades of loyal service to Wren's family. A former groundskeeper spoke of wages withheld for months at a time, of threats made against his family when he dared to request what he was owed. A young woman, no older than Eliza herself, came forward with visible reluctance and described, through tears, an encounter with Wren during her brief time working in his household that closely mirrored the pattern of controlling, cruel behavior Eliza herself had described. Perhaps most significant of all was the testimony offered, quietly and carefully, by one of Wren's own distant cousins, a man named Charles Whitmore, who had long harbored private reservations about his relative's conduct, but had never found the courage or the occasion to speak openly against him. Whitmore approached Alaric directly, having heard through family channels that a serious inquiry was underway, and provided detailed knowledge of Wren's finances, including several instances where loans extended to local magistrates appeared to have been used deliberately to secure their silence or cooperation on matters that should have been investigated far more thoroughly. "I should have said something years ago," Whitmore admitted quietly during his meeting with Alaric and Fairfax. "I told myself it wasn't my place, that family loyalty required silence. I understand now how wrong that reasoning was." With Whitmore's financial records added to the growing collection of testimony, the picture of Josiah Wren's conduct became not simply a matter of personal cruelty toward those closest to him, but a broader pattern of corruption, manipulation, and abuse of power that had gone unchecked for years, protected by a carefully constructed web of debts, favors, and fear. Wren, for his part, did not remain passive during these weeks. Rumors reached Alaric of Wren attempting to discredit him within social circles, spreading whispered suggestions that the Duke's sudden interest in Eliza's welfare was motivated by something far less noble than genuine concern, hinting at impropriety that had no basis in truth, but which, in a county built on reputation and gossip, still carried the potential to do damage. Alaric bore these rumors with steady patience, refusing to dignify them with public denial, trusting instead that the weight of gathered evidence would speak far louder than any whispered insinuation. More troubling were the reports that reached him of Wren applying direct pressure against those who had come forward. A tenant family received an unexpected visit from men associated with Wren's estate, their presence carrying an unmistakable air of intimidation, despite no explicit threat being spoken aloud. A former servant found their new position suddenly, inexplicably terminated, the timing far too convenient to be coincidence. Alaric responded to each incident swiftly, ensuring those affected received whatever support was needed, while also carefully documenting each instance of retaliation as further evidence of Wren's character and conduct. "He's growing desperate," Fairfax observed during one of their regular meetings, reviewing the latest additions to their case. "Desperate men make mistakes, Your Grace. This latest attempt to intimidate witnesses may well work in our favor, if we can properly document it. I'd rather no one suffer further for having trusted us with the truth," Alaric replied, though he recognized the practical value in Fairfax's observation. As the weeks passed, Eliza remained closely involved in the growing effort, her initial fear gradually transforming into something steadier and more resolute. She met personally with several of the other women who had come forward, offering quiet comfort and solidarity born of shared experience, and her presence seemed to give genuine courage to others who might otherwise have hesitated to add their own voices to the mounting testimony against Wren. "I never imagined there could be so many of us," Eliza said quietly one evening, sitting with Alaric in the Manor's library, the fire casting warm light across the room. "All this time I believed I was simply unfortunate, that whatever happened to me was somehow unique to my circumstances. Learning how many others suffered the same treatment," she paused, shaking her head slowly. "It's both a comfort and a horror, if that makes any sense at all." "It makes perfect sense," Alaric said gently. "There's comfort in knowing you were never truly alone, even during the times it felt that way, and horror in understanding just how long this pattern was allowed to continue unchecked." Eliza nodded, her gaze drifting toward the fire. "What happens once everything is gathered? Once the case is ready to be presented?" "Fairfax believes we'll have enough by the end of the month to formally request an inquiry before the regional court," Alaric said. "It will be a public matter at that point, impossible for Wren to dismiss quietly or bury through influence with the local magistrates alone. There will be a hearing, testimony given under oath, and ultimately, a judgment rendered by officials with no personal stake in protecting Wren's reputation." "Will I need to testify?" Eliza asked, her voice quieter now, old fear resurfacing briefly beneath her hard-won courage. Alaric met her eyes steadily. "Only if you choose to. No one will force that decision upon you, Eliza. But I believe, given everything I've come to know of your strength these past weeks, that your testimony would carry significant weight, should you choose to give it." Eliza was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "I want to," she said finally, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "Not because anyone is asking me to, but because I think I need to be the one who finally says it all out loud where it can't be dismissed or hidden away any longer, for myself and for everyone else he's hurt who might not have the courage yet to speak for themselves." Alaric felt a surge of quiet pride at her words, though beneath it lingered a protective concern for what such public testimony might cost her, emotionally and otherwise. "Whatever you decide, I will stand beside you through every step of it," he said firmly. "You will never face any part of this alone, not while I have any say in the matter." As the final preparations for the inquiry moved forward, word of the growing case against Josiah Wren finally became impossible to contain within quiet circles. Across the county, from the smallest tenant farms to the grand estates of neighboring landowners, conversations shifted, attention sharpened, and a quiet but unmistakable tension settled over those who had, until now, comfortably operated under the same assumptions of unchecked power and privilege that Wren himself had relied upon for years. Some landowners, sensing the shifting winds, began quietly correcting old grievances of their own, settling long overdue debts to tenants, dismissing overseers known for excessive cruelty, careful to distance themselves from any association with practices that might soon draw unwanted scrutiny. Others, still confident in their own protections and connections, dismissed the growing case as an overreach by an idealistic young duke, who would soon learn the limits of his influence against men of true, established power. Alaric paid little attention to either reaction, focused entirely on ensuring the case against Wren was built as thoroughly and carefully as possible, leaving no opening for dismissal or doubt. He understood, better than most, that this inquiry would likely become a defining moment for the county, not simply in determining Wren's fate, but in signaling clearly to every man who had grown comfortable believing themselves untouchable that such comfort could no longer be taken for granted. The night before the formal request for inquiry was to be submitted to the regional court, Alaric found Eliza standing on the manor's terrace, looking out over the moonlit grounds, her expression thoughtful and calm in a way that reflected how far she had come since the frightened, broken woman he had carried in from the storm weeks before. "Nervous?" he asked gently, joining her at the railing. "Terrified," Eliza admitted with a small, wry smile. "But not the same kind of terrified I used to feel. This feels different. This feels like fear standing beside courage, rather than fear standing alone." Alaric smiled at that, something warm settling in his chest at how far she had traveled, both physically and within herself, since that first stormy night. "That's precisely how courage feels in my experience," he said quietly. "It's never the absence of fear. It's choosing to move forward regardless." Eliza turned to look at him, moonlight softening her features, the last remaining shadows of old bruises now entirely faded from her skin, though Alaric understood some scars would take considerably longer to heal fully. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me the chance to find that courage. I don't know that I ever would have without you." "You would have," Alaric said firmly, meeting her eyes. "It simply would have taken longer and been considerably more difficult without support, but that fire was always in you, Eliza. I merely gave it space to grow." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, the county spread out quiet and unaware beneath the moonlight, unaware that within days, the careful, protected world men like Josiah Wren had built for themselves was about to be shaken to its very foundation. The formal inquiry was set to take place at the regional courthouse, a grand stone building nearly 2 days' journey from Thornwood Manor, chosen deliberately for its distance from the local magistrates, whose loyalties had long been compromised by Wren's careful cultivation of debts and favors. Word of the proceedings spread quickly once the official summons was issued, and by the time Alaric's carriage arrived at the courthouse steps, a considerable crowd had already gathered, drawn by curiosity, concern, or in some cases, a personal stake in the outcome. Eliza sat beside him in the carriage, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale but composed. She had insisted on making the journey despite Alaric's gentle suggestion that she might prefer to wait and provide her testimony through written statement alone. "I need to be there," she had told him firmly the night before they departed. "I need him to see me stand and speak the truth, without fear, in front of everyone." The courtroom itself was formal and imposing, presided over by a regional judge named Harwick, a stern, weathered man known throughout the region for his uncompromising fairness and complete indifference to matters of social standing or influence. Fairfax had assured Alaric repeatedly that Harwick was precisely the kind of official who could not be swayed by Wren's usual methods of persuasion. And as the proceedings began, Alaric found himself grateful beyond measure for that assurance. Josiah Wren arrived with his own legal representation, a sharp-featured lawyer from the capital known for defending wealthy clients against precisely these kinds of accusations. Wren himself appeared composed, even confident, dressed impeccably, his expression carrying the same practiced charm Alaric had witnessed during their first confrontation. But as the proceedings unfolded over the following 2 days, that composure began to crack, piece by piece, under the sheer weight of accumulated testimony. Tenant families spoke of unfair evictions and manipulated rents. Former servants described wages withheld and threats issued against those who dared to protest their treatment. Charles Whitmore's financial records were entered as formal evidence, revealing clearly documented instances of loans extended to local magistrates under circumstances that strongly suggested deliberate influence rather than legitimate business dealings. Dr. Whitfield testified regarding the pattern of injuries he had treated over the years among Wren's household staff and tenants. Injuries he had long suspected were not accidental, but had lacked sufficient evidence to formally report. And then, on the second day of proceedings, Eliza took the stand. She walked to the witness chair with steady, deliberate steps, her chin lifted despite the visible tension in her shoulders. Alaric watched from his seat, every muscle in his body tensed with protective concern, though he had promised himself he would not intervene unless absolutely necessary, understanding that this moment belonged entirely to her. Under careful, respectful questioning from Fairfax, Eliza recounted her story with a clarity and composure that seemed to surprise even herself. The forced engagement born from her family's desperate financial circumstances, the gradual transformation of Wren's charm into cruelty, once he believed her securely bound to him, the months of controlled fear that had followed, and finally, the desperate escape attempt that had left her broken and bleeding on a lonely road. Wren's lawyer attempted, predictably, to challenge her account, suggesting her injuries could have resulted from misadventure rather than deliberate harm, implying that a young woman's memory of frightening events might easily be distorted or exaggerated under emotional distress. But Eliza met each challenge with calm, unwavering clarity, her answers precise and consistent, never once faltering under the pressure of cross-examination. "You claim these injuries were inflicted deliberately," the lawyer pressed, his tone carrying poorly concealed skepticism. "Yet you offer no direct witness to the incident itself, only your own account." "I offer my own account," Eliza replied evenly, "because I am the one who lived it. I understand that may be difficult for some to accept as sufficient. But I would ask the court to consider why so many others, entirely unconnected to my own circumstances, have come forward describing remarkably similar patterns of cruelty at the hands of the same man." A murmur rippled through the courtroom at her composed, pointed response, and even Judge Harwick's stern expression seemed to soften slightly with something approaching respect. Wren's lawyer, sensing the shifting mood of the room, quickly moved to conclude his questioning, unwilling to risk further damage to his client's already crumbling credibility. By the end of the second day, the cumulative weight of testimony had become overwhelming. What had begun as a single accusation against a respected landowner had grown, through careful, patient investigation, into a comprehensive picture of sustained cruelty, financial manipulation, and abuse of power spanning years, and affecting dozens of lives throughout the county. Perhaps most damaging of all to Wren's defense was the sudden, unexpected shift among those who had once counted themselves among his allies. Local magistrates who had previously benefited from his loans and favors, recognizing the overwhelming strength of the evidence now presented before a judge entirely outside their influence, quickly distanced themselves from any prior association, several offering their own carefully worded statements, acknowledging concerns they claimed to have long harbored but never previously acted upon. Business associates who had once praised Wren's shrewd dealings suddenly discovered urgent reasons to avoid any public connection to his name. Even members of his own extended family, following Whitmore's example, began quietly confirming details of his character that painted a far darker picture than the polished reputation he had spent years cultivating. Wren watched this abandonment unfold with visible mounting desperation, his earlier confidence entirely replaced by barely contained panic as he realized the full extent of what he was facing. During a brief recess on the second day, Alaric caught sight of him in the courthouse corridor, his composure completely abandoned, arguing in low, furious tones with his own lawyer, who appeared increasingly reluctant to continue defending a case that had grown so thoroughly indefensible. "This isn't over," Wren hissed at Alaric as their paths crossed briefly in the corridor, his voice carrying none of its earlier polished charm. "Whatever the outcome here, I have resources you cannot begin to imagine. This will not be the end of it." "Perhaps not," Alaric replied evenly, refusing to be baited into a public display of anger that might undermine the careful, measured case they had built. "But I suspect, Mr. Wren, that whatever resources you believe remain at your disposal, you will find considerably fewer people willing to align themselves with you moving forward. Reputation, as you once reminded me yourself, is a fragile thing." Wren's expression twisted with fury, but before he could respond further, a court official called the proceedings back into session, and Alaric returned to the courtroom without another word, leaving Wren standing alone in the corridor, his carefully constructed world continuing to crumble around him. Judge Harwick's final ruling came on the morning of the third day, delivered with the same stern, unwavering authority that had characterized the entire proceeding. He acknowledged the overwhelming weight of testimony presented against Josiah Wren, the consistent pattern of cruelty, manipulation, and abuse of power spanning multiple victims and multiple years, and the clear evidence of deliberate corruption involving local officials who had allowed this pattern to continue unchecked. Wren was found guilty on multiple counts, including deliberate harm, financial manipulation, and corruption of local officials. His properties and holdings were placed under formal review, with significant portions ordered to be redistributed as compensation to those he had wronged, including the tenant families he had unfairly evicted and the former servants whose wages he had withheld. He was stripped of what limited official standing he held within the county's local governance, and though the specific terms of his personal punishment would be determined through further proceedings, it was made unmistakably clear that Josiah Wren's days of unchecked power and influence within the county had come to a definitive end. As the judgment was read aloud, Alaric watched Wren's face drain of all remaining color, his earlier fury replaced by something closer to hollow, disbelieving shock, as though he had never truly believed until this precise moment that consequences could actually reach him. Beside Alaric, Eliza sat very still, her hands clasped tightly together, tears finally slipping down her cheeks, not tears of fear or sorrow this time, but something closer to overwhelming, long-delayed release. "It's over," Alaric said quietly, reaching over to gently take her hand, offering silent support as the weight of the moment settled fully over her. "It's over," Eliza repeated softly, as though testing the truth of the words, her voice trembling with an emotion too complex to name simply. Relief and grief and vindication all tangled together after months of fear finally given voice, and at last, formally acknowledged. Outside the courthouse, as the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of the judgment spreading rapidly through the gathered onlookers, and soon, throughout the entire county, Alaric guided Eliza gently toward their waiting carriage, shielding her as best he could from the curious stares and whispered conversations that inevitably followed such a significant public event. "You did something remarkable today," he told her quietly as they settled into the carriage for the journey home. "Not just for yourself, Eliza, but for every person Wren ever harmed who never had the chance or the courage to speak as openly as you did." Eliza wiped at her eyes, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through the emotional exhaustion of the past 3 days. "We did something remarkable," she corrected gently. "I couldn't have found the courage to stand in that courtroom without knowing you were beside me every step of the way." Alaric returned her smile, something warm and steady settling in his chest as the carriage pulled away from the courthouse, carrying them both back toward Thornwood Manor, and toward whatever new chapter awaited them now that the darkest one had finally, truly come to a close. Behind them, throughout the county, word of Josiah Wren's downfall continued to spread, carried from village to village, farm to farm, a quiet but unmistakable signal to every man who had ever believed his own cruelty might remain forever protected by wealth and standing alone. The weeks that followed the ruling brought a slow, steady transformation to the county, one that Alaric watched unfold with quiet satisfaction, though he understood better than most that true change rarely arrived all at once. Josiah Wren's remaining lands were formally redistributed under the court's supervision, with the tenant families he had once treated so unfairly finally receiving compensation long overdue. Some choosing to remain on the land they had worked for generations, now under fairer terms, others using their settlements to build new lives entirely elsewhere. Charles Whitmore, whose courage in coming forward had proven so pivotal to the case, took on a quiet but respected role helping oversee the transition, determined to see his family's tarnished legacy replaced with something more honorable. Beyond Wren's own downfall, the ripples of the case spread further than even Alaric had initially anticipated. Other landowners throughout the county, having watched one of their own stripped of standing and influence so thoroughly, began quietly reconsidering practices they had long taken for granted. Overseers known for harsh treatment of tenants and servants found themselves suddenly dismissed by employers eager to avoid similar scrutiny. Local magistrates, chastened by their own narrow escapes from formal censure during the proceedings, began enforcing existing protections for tenants and laborers with considerably more diligence than they had ever previously shown. It was not a perfect transformation, nor an immediate one. Alaric understood clearly that old patterns of cruelty and abuse of power did not simply vanish because one man had been publicly disgraced. But something fundamental had shifted nonetheless. A quiet but unmistakable message had been sent throughout the county that such cruelty would no longer be met with comfortable silence, that those who suffered under the unchecked power of others now had somewhere to turn, someone willing to listen and to act. Eliza remained at Thornwood Manor throughout this period of transition, her presence gradually shifting from that of a recovering guest to something closer to a genuine member of the household. Mrs. Pemberton, who had grown quietly fond of her over the preceding weeks, began including her in the daily rhythms of managing the estate, teaching her the intricacies of household accounts and correspondence, skills Eliza absorbed eagerly, grateful for purpose and structure after months defined by fear and uncertainty. The staff who had once whispered curious speculation about the mysterious young woman upstairs now greeted her warmly in the hallways, having witnessed firsthand the quiet strength and grace with which she had faced her ordeal. Alaric found himself, more often than not, seeking out her company even when no pressing matter required it, sharing meals together in comfortable conversation, walking the manor's gardens in the cool evening air, discussing books from his extensive library that Eliza had begun eagerly working her way through, having been denied such simple pleasures during her years under Wren's controlling influence. Their conversations grew easier with each passing week, the careful formality of their earlier interactions gradually giving way to genuine warmth and easy familiarity. "You've changed this place," Mrs. Pemberton remarked to Alaric one afternoon, finding him watching from the study window as Eliza walked among the rose bushes below, her laughter carrying faintly on the breeze as she spoke with one of the younger gardeners. "Not just the county, Your Grace. This house. It feels different than it has in years." Alaric considered her words carefully, watching Eliza pause to examine a particularly vibrant bloom, her posture relaxed and unguarded in a way it had not been during those first difficult weeks of her recovery. "I suppose it does," he admitted quietly. "I hadn't fully noticed until you said so." "She's found her strength again," Mrs. Pemberton continued, her tone carrying quiet affection. "But I think, Your Grace, that she's not the only one who has changed these past months." Alaric did not respond immediately, though he understood well enough what the older woman meant. He had entered this entire ordeal driven by a sense of duty and outrage at injustice, determined to see wrong made right regardless of personal cost. But somewhere along the way, that determination had grown into something else entirely, something he had not fully allowed himself to name until watching Eliza laugh freely in his gardens, safe and unafraid for what seemed at last like the first time in years. That evening, as the sun set in warm golden hues across the manor's grounds, Alaric found Eliza once again on the terrace, a favorite spot of hers where she often watched the day fade into evening, the moment representing, she had once told him, a quiet symbol of the peace she had finally found after so much turmoil. "I received a letter today," she said as he joined her at the railing, "from my mother. She's heard everything that's happened, of course. It seems the entire county has heard by now. She wishes to see me once I'm ready." "That's wonderful news," Alaric said warmly, genuinely pleased on her behalf. "Will you go to her?" Eliza nodded slowly. "I think I will soon. There's still much I need to say to her, things I never had the courage to share while I was still trapped in that engagement. But I find, strangely, that I'm not afraid of that conversation the way I once might have been." She glanced sideways at him, a small, thoughtful smile playing at her lips. "I think that's largely thanks to you." "You give me too much credit," Alaric said gently. "The courage was always yours, Eliza. I simply gave you a place safe enough to remember it existed." Eliza turned to face him fully then, her expression growing more serious, though warmth remained clearly present beneath it. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about what comes next. Once I've seen my mother, once everything with Wren's case is fully settled. I don't wish to simply remain a guest here indefinitely, relying on your generosity without purpose of my own." Alaric felt a small flicker of concern at her words, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, unwilling to influence whatever decision she was working her way toward. "What did you have in mind?" "I don't fully know yet," Eliza admitted, "but I've enjoyed learning the household accounts from Mrs. Pemberton these past weeks, more than I expected to. I've been considering whether there might be some way I could make myself genuinely useful here, in some capacity beyond simply being cared for." She paused, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "That is, if you would be amenable to such an arrangement." Something warm and hopeful stirred in Alaric's chest at her words, though he was careful to keep his response measured, unwilling to presume more than she was offering. "I would welcome that, Eliza, more than you might realize. This household, this entire county, has been better for your presence these past months. I would be glad to see that continue, in whatever form suits you best." Eliza's smile widened, genuine relief and happiness evident in her expression, and for a long moment they simply stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last light of day fade slowly across the horizon. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza said eventually, her voice softer now, carrying a note of uncertainty that Alaric had not heard from her in some time. "Of course. That first night," she said quietly, "when you found me on the road, you asked me who had done this to me. I couldn't answer then, but I've thought about that question many times since, about how gently you asked it, how patiently you waited for an answer you had every reason to believe might never come." She turned to look at him fully, her eyes searching his face carefully. "Why did that gentleness matter so much to you? Most men in your position, I think, would have simply demanded answers, or worse, dismissed the matter entirely rather than involve themselves so deeply in a stranger's troubles." Alaric considered her question thoughtfully before answering, understanding that his response deserved the same honesty she had shown him throughout their months together. "Because I understood, even in that first moment, that you had already suffered enough demands, enough people taking rather than offering," he said quietly. "I didn't want to add to that suffering by forcing you toward answers before you were ready to give them. Some wounds, Eliza, heal only when given the space and patience to do so naturally, rather than being torn open again through impatience or force." Eliza's eyes glistened slightly in the fading light, though her expression remained steady, filled with quiet gratitude. "You gave me exactly what I needed, even before I understood what that was myself," she said softly. "I don't think I've properly thanked you for that, not really, not for all of it." "You don't need to thank me," Alaric said gently, reaching to take her hand, a gesture that had grown natural between them over the preceding weeks. "Watching you reclaim your strength, your voice, your life, that has been thanks enough, and more than I ever expected when I first pulled you from that ditch." They stood together as darkness settled fully over the grounds, stars beginning to emerge overhead, the manor's windows glowing warmly behind them. Eliza did not pull her hand away, and Alaric found himself in no hurry to release it either, both of them content, for now, simply to stand together in the quiet peace of an evening that, months before, neither could have imagined possible. In the weeks that followed, life at Thornwood Manor settled into a new, steady rhythm. Eliza traveled to see her mother, a reunion filled with tears and long-overdue honesty, and returned to the manor with a lighter heart, her relationship with her family finally beginning to heal alongside everything else she had reclaimed. She took on increasing responsibility within the household, her natural intelligence and growing confidence earning genuine respect among the staff who had once only whispered curiously about her presence. Throughout the county, the changes set in motion by Wren's downfall continued to take root. Fairfax, whose integrity and careful work had proven so essential throughout the case, found his own reputation considerably strengthened, eventually earning greater influence within the region's judicial affairs, ensuring that the protections established during Wren's case would not simply fade once public attention moved elsewhere. Tenant families throughout the county, encouraged by what they had witnessed, grew more willing to report unfair treatment, knowing now that at least some avenues existed for genuine accountability rather than comfortable silence. And Josiah Wren, stripped of his lands, his influence, and the reputation he had spent years carefully constructing, faded gradually from the county's collective attention, a cautionary tale whispered occasionally among those who had once feared him, a reminder of how quickly unchecked cruelty could crumble once genuinely confronted. One evening, nearly 6 months after that first stormy night on the road, Alaric found Eliza once again in the manor's gardens, tending carefully to the roses that had become something of a personal project for her over the preceding months. She looked up as he approached, offering the same warm, easy smile that had become so familiar to him, so essential to the quiet happiness that had settled over his household since her arrival. "You look thoughtful," she observed, brushing dirt gently from her hands as she rose to meet him. "I've been thinking," Alaric said, "about how much has changed since that night I found you on the road, how different both our lives have become." Eliza nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind his words. "It feels like a lifetime ago sometimes," she admitted, "and other times like it happened only yesterday." Alaric reached out gently, taking her hand as he had grown accustomed to doing, though this time something in his expression carried a deeper seriousness than their usual quiet moments together. "I asked you once who had hurt you," he said softly, "and it took considerable courage on your part before you were finally ready to answer. I find myself now wanting to ask you a different question entirely, one I hope you'll feel equally ready, when the time is right, to answer honestly." Eliza's breath caught slightly, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression as she studied his face carefully. "What question is that?" she asked softly. Alaric smiled, warm and genuine, the quiet steadiness that had carried them both through months of hardship now settling into something gentler, something filled with quiet hope for whatever future still lay ahead of them. "Not tonight," he said softly. "Tonight, I simply wanted you to know that whatever question I eventually ask, and whatever answer you choose to give, you will always have exactly as much time and space as you need to find it, just as you always have from that very first night." Eliza's eyes shone with unshed tears, though her smile remained bright and genuine, filled with a peace and happiness that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those dark, frightened days following her escape. She squeezed his hand gently, stepping closer beside him as they turned together to look out over the gardens, the manor standing steady and warm behind them, and the county beyond it slowly, steadily healing from wounds too long left unaddressed. Whatever the future held, both of them understood clearly that it would be built not on fear or control, as Eliza's past had once been, but on patience, respect, and the quiet, unwavering strength they had each discovered within themselves and within each other, strength born from a single stormy night when a Duke's soft, simple question had finally begun to set one frightened woman free, and had ultimately reshaped an entire county's understanding of what true justice and true kindness could accomplish when someone finally chose not to look away. Spring arrived early that year, the fields surrounding Thornwood Manor turning green weeks ahead of schedule, as though the county itself had shaken off the last traces of a long, difficult winter. Alaric stood at the edge of the eastern meadow one bright morning, watching a group of tenant farmers repairing fences that had once been neglected under Wren's careless management, their conversation easy and unhurried, free of the tension that had once hung over every interaction between landowner and laborer in that part of the county. Much had changed in the year since the courthouse ruling. Fairfax, now serving in a more prominent judicial role across the region, had helped establish new protections for tenants and household staff, formal channels through which grievances could be reported and investigated without fear of retaliation. Other counties, hearing of the reforms sparked by Wren's downfall, had begun quietly adopting similar measures, the ripple effects of one dark night on a rain-soaked road extending further than anyone involved could have originally imagined. Charles Whitmore had taken on responsibility for a portion of the redistributed land, transforming it into a model of fair, respectful management that other landowners increasingly looked to as an example worth following. Even those who had once resisted such changes out of stubborn pride found themselves gradually adjusting their own practices, unwilling to risk the kind of public reckoning that had so thoroughly dismantled Wren's standing. Eliza, meanwhile, had grown into her role at Thornwood Manor with quiet confidence, now overseeing much of the estate's correspondence and charitable efforts alongside Mrs. Pemberton, who had come to treat her with the warmth and respect due a trusted colleague rather than simply a guest under the Duke's protection. She had established, with Alaric's full support, a small fund dedicated to assisting women fleeing dangerous circumstances similar to her own, offering temporary shelter and practical support without judgment or delay. Word of the fund's existence spread quietly but steadily, and more than once, a frightened young woman arrived at the manor's gates in circumstances that echoed painfully with Eliza's own arrival months before, only to find, this time, an experienced and compassionate guide already prepared to help. "It never gets easier," Eliza admitted to Alaric one evening, after helping settle a newly arrived young woman named Margaret into one of the manor's guest rooms, the girl's story bearing uncomfortable similarities to Eliza's own past. "Seeing it happen to someone else, I thought perhaps with time it might feel less painful. It doesn't." "Perhaps it isn't meant to," Alaric said gently, settling beside her on the terrace where they so often found themselves at day's end. "Perhaps that continued pain is simply proof that you still care as deeply as you did the very first time, rather than growing numb to it." Eliza considered his words thoughtfully, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "I suppose that's a kinder way to look at it than I'd managed on my own." Their conversations had grown steadily more comfortable over the preceding months, the careful formality of their early acquaintance long since replaced by an easy intimacy built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Alaric had asked his question, eventually, on a quiet winter evening much like the many they had shared since Eliza's arrival, not with elaborate ceremony, but with the same gentle sincerity that had characterized every moment between them since that very first night on the storm-soaked road. Eliza's answer had come readily, without hesitation, a clear and joyful yes that had filled the manor with a warmth it had not known in years. Their wedding, held in early summer beneath the same rose gardens Eliza had so carefully tended during her recovery, was modest by the standards of the county's usual grand affairs, attended by close friends, loyal staff, and tenant families whose lives had been touched, directly or indirectly, by the events of the preceding year. Eliza's mother stood proudly among the guests, her relationship with her daughter fully mended, grateful beyond words to witness such happiness after so much earlier suffering. Fairfax served as witness, alongside Mrs. Pemberton, whose stern composure finally cracked into unrestrained tears of joy as she watched the ceremony unfold. There was no trace of Josiah Wren at the celebration, nor any lingering shadow of fear that might once have dimmed such a joyous occasion. He had left the county entirely months earlier, his name rarely spoken aloud anymore except as a cautionary example, his once imposing presence reduced to little more than a distant, unpleasant memory for those who had survived his cruelty. As the celebration continued late into the warm summer evening, Alaric found a quiet moment alone with Eliza near the edge of the gardens, away from the joyful noise of gathered guests. The two of them simply standing together beneath a sky brilliant with stars. "Do you remember," Eliza asked softly, resting her head against his shoulder, "the first question you ever asked me?" "I remember," Alaric said quietly, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "I don't think I'll ever forget it." "I couldn't answer you then," Eliza said. "Not for a long time. But I think if you asked me again tonight, I'd have a very different answer to give." Alaric smiled, warmth spreading through his chest at her words. "And what answer would that be?" Eliza lifted her head to look at him, her eyes bright with happiness, entirely free of the fear and pain that had once clouded them so completely. "That the man who hurt me is gone," she said softly, "and that the man who saved me, who gave me the courage to save myself, is the same man I now stand beside as my husband." I couldn't have imagined a better answer, not on that terrible night, and not in all the months that followed. Alaric drew her close, holding her gently beneath the vast, star-filled sky, the quiet peace of the moment carrying within it every hard-won victory of the year that had passed. A broken young woman made whole again. A corrupt system finally held accountable. An entire county gradually learning to build itself on kindness and fairness rather than fear and unchecked power. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, both of them understood clearly that they would face them together, bound not by circumstance or obligation, but by a bond forged through genuine courage, patience, and an unwavering commitment to standing beside one another, no matter what storms might come. And throughout the county, in villages and farms and grand estates alike, the story of that soft, simple question asked on a rain-soaked road continued to be told and retold. A quiet reminder that even the smallest acts of genuine kindness could, in time, reshape not just a single life, but an entire community's understanding of justice, courage, and the quiet, unshakable power of simply choosing not to look away.